Well, good afternoon to all of you joining us today, and welcome to the Office of Research Regulatory Affairs Research Matters. I am Scott Myers, the Clinical Research Educator for UT Southwestern's Office of Research Regulatory Affairs, and I'll be one of the moderators for today's session. Just some quick reminders. If you have any questions for our presenters during today's session, please type them in the Q&A. One of the moderators will respond to you during the session, or we will address it at the end of the presentations. This session is being recorded, and you can watch it again right after it's finished by clicking on the Microsoft Teams live link in the email invitation. You can find the links to future meetings and past recordings on the Human Research Protection Program Office's Research Matters website under Training and Resources page. Also, as a reminder, we've had a lot of questions about this. The slides themselves from today's presentation will not be posted to the website, just the recording. The slides will be sent out with the listserv after the session, and you can also just request those later as well if you don't receive the listserv or can't find it. Okay, we do provide a certificate of attendance for those of you who logged in using a valid email address. If you do not receive one via email, but should have, please send an email to hrpp@utsouthwestern.edu to request a certificate. Lastly, as always, we love hearing from you. We use the information that you provide in the surveys to plan for future topics for these sessions. It's a great opportunity for you to let us know how our speakers did, how our department is doing. So please, if you have a moment, take a few minutes to complete that survey. You may access the survey via the phone QR code here. We will also be posting a link in the Q&A. All right, so here is the agenda for today. First, Brendan Paulman, our program manager for Reliance Studies, will present utilizing external IRBs, an overview of the Reliance process from startup to activation. Then I will present to you on some human subjects research, regulatory fundamentals, particularly talk about those studies that do not undergo IRB review. Doesn't mean they still undergo administrative review, but not IRB review. And finally, if time permits, we will conclude with an open Q&A session. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brendan.
All right. So it's been a little while since we had a presentation on Reliance, so kind of just wanted to give a brief overview of the topic with some updates that have come with the Ethos system, which was introduced about a year ago. I'm Brendan Paulman. I'm the Reliance Program Manager. If you've ever had a Reliance study or any Reliance submission, we've probably spoken or exchanged emails. This is our Reliance team here at HRPP. Consists of myself and then our two regulatory analysts, Marilyn and Ohenawa. So just a brief overview of single IRB. Single IRB involves using one IRB of record or a reviewing IRB as for the regulatory and ethical review for all the sites participating in a multi-site study. So an HRPP consists of several different parts, and when we're relying on an external IRB, we're only giving away a few of those responsibilities. So when we're using an external IRB, we're giving away the IRB review, and then in some cases, the HIPAA privacy review. But we're retaining responsibilities such as the institutional policy verification, local state policy verification, resource verification, and then training and qualification verification. So, you might be thinking, if we're using an external IRB, why do we still have to submit this form in Ethos? That's the reason why. Even though we're using an external IRB for the regulatory review, there's still components that the institution needs to review. So just an overview of some of the policies related to single IRB. The NIH mandated single IRB be used for NIH-funded multi-site domestic non-exempt research starting January 25th, 2018. The Common Rule followed suit in 2020. And then the FDA in September 2022 proposed that they were going to harmonize with the SIRB mandate, but this is not yet been implemented. It was supposed to be implemented at several points in the past. Was going to begin around this time last year, then it got pushed to May 2025, but so far that has not happened. And at this point, we're not really sure when it is going to happen. So some reliance terminology. These are terms you'll likely hear used pretty often when referring to reliance studies. And so the single IRB or the SIRB is the IRB of record. This is the lead IRB, which oversees all of the research being conducted at the various locations. The relying institution is the entity that is using the single IRB as for their the external IRB as their for their IRB review. And then the reliance agreement is the documentation outlining that the relying institution will be using the single IRB for the IRB review of their research. So oftentimes SIRB and reliance are used interchangeably. At UT Southwestern, we use SIRB in cases where UT Southwestern is serving as the IRB of record for external sites. And then we use reliance to refer to when an external IRB is serving as the IRB of record for UT Southwestern. All right, and then just a brief overview of a couple of different types of reliance agreements. The Smart IRB agreement is the most commonly used reliance agreement between institutions. The Smart IRB agreement establishes terms of the reliance agreement, which can be used when documenting reliance between two institutions. So this is a case like if we were relying on Ohio State or Harvard or another institution, most often we'll be using the Smart IRB agreement. About 1,500 institutions in the US have signed on to Smart IRB. So when documenting reliance, the only thing that needs to be done is sign a letter of acknowledgement instead of having to negotiate the actual terms of the agreement between the two institutions. And just to point out, Smart IRB is an agreement. It's not itself an IRB. The other major type of agreement that we use is called a master service agreement. This is an agreement that is executed between the institution and typically a commercial IRB, such as Advarra or WCG. So at UT Southwestern, we have master service agreements with Advarra and WCG, meaning we've already agreed to their terms of reliance for particular studies. So these are a few of the types of IRBs. We have commercial IRBs, such as WCG and Advarra. There's a few others we see now, like Sterling and Branny. Institutional IRBs, these would be IRBs at other medical centers and academic institutions. And then the cooperative group IRBs, such as the NCIC IRB or the National Marrow Donor Program IRB. So the major commercial IRBs we use are WCG and Advarra. There's also cases when UT Southwestern has a institutional conflict of interest where we may use these IRBs, but typically they're used for industry-sponsored research. As I mentioned before, we have a master service agreement with WCG and Advarra, so we've already agreed to terms for the reliance agreement. However, we do still require that a reliance request be submitted when using these IRBs. We still look at these studies on a case-by-case basis to determine if the situation is appropriate for UT Southwestern to use these external IRBs. UT Southwestern often collaborates with other medical centers and universities, and when appropriate, will rely on the IRBs of these institutions as well. Each IRB will have its own policies, and it's important to be familiar with the policies of the reviewing IRB especially the policies regarding the use of short form consents, reportable events, and HIPAA waivers and authorizations. When you're working with the lead site to onboard UT Southwestern, there will often be a site information sheet that we'll need to fill out that this will inform the lead study team and IRB of any UT Southwestern specific requirements which may apply to that study. We'll also provide the lead site with an institutional profile, which provides general information about our policies. The consent form template for the lead site is typically used in these situations, and we have required language on our forms page of our website, which can be added to this consent template. Once the reliance agreement is completed, as I mentioned, we'll use the SMART IRB agreement typically in these situations. The UT Southwestern study team will need to work with the lead site on submitting a modification to the external IRB to obtain site approval for UT Southwestern. And then finally, the NCIC IRB, which is commonly used for cooperative group cancer studies. This can include like COG, Alliance, NRG, ECOG. Unlike most studies where UT Southwestern is relying on external IRB, we don't really require the reliance request for these. Ethos, I think, will still make you submit something, but in these situations, we'll just go and approve it. For the consent form for these, we have pre-approved language which can be inserted. And so with these, the consent template can be taken from CTSU, which is the website that the NCIC IRB posts all their documents to. And this language can just be added to the consent form directly without having to resubmit it to the NCIC IRB. And then also notably for NCI studies, in most situations, we'll also cede privacy board review to the external IRB. But importantly, for NCIC IRB studies, we retain this responsibility. So UT Southwestern will actually be the IRB that issues the HIPAA waiver if the study needs one. And we'll use the separate authorization from the consent form or Form F. All right, so now I'll go through the process of relying on an external IRB. So the first step will be to submit the reliance request. This will initiate the process for relying on an external IRB. This is started by creating the study in Ethos and then completing through section 6 of the Ethos Smart Form. At this point, the main items we need are the protocol and the performance sites, which will be involved. So I believe section 5 is where you enter the performance sites. So we'll need to know if UT Southwestern, Children's, Parkland are involved in the study. And then the protocol can be uploaded to section 6. For the rest of the form, if you don't have that information at this time, you can just use placeholders or put pending or NA until you're able to save the form. And then once you get to the point where you're ready to submit the study, you can go back and fill all of that out. So once you get through section 6 and you're able to save the form, you'll go back to the main study page and use the Add Reliance Institute information. And so this is the reliance request, which will notify our office that you're wanting to use an external IRB for this study. This is basically the equivalent to the old REDCap form that we used to use, but now this process is done in Ethos. So once the request is submitted, the HRPP office will review and then proceed with initiating the reliance agreement if we determine it's a situation where it's appropriate to use an external IRB. We recommend booking a consultation, especially if you're not familiar with this process. We can kind of go over it with you and then answer any specific questions, but this is not required. So while UT Southwestern serves as the IRB of record for our affiliated institutions such as Children's and Parkland, since they're separate institutions, They will need their own reliance agreements. It's a kind of a common misconception that a reliance agreement is executed between IRBs. It's actually between the institution and the IRB. So UT Southwestern, Parkland, and Children's all will have their own separate reliance agreements. And at this stage, it's important to notify the sponsor or the lead site if any of our affiliated institutions will be involved, as they'll likely need to be aware that they'll need a separate agreement. So once we have the reliance agreement completed, the next step is to obtain site approval from the reviewing IRB. The site-specific language will need to be added to the consent form by the UT Southwestern study team. For WCG, there's actually a checklist we have on the HRPP website, which can be filled out and submitted in WCG's application. And then the WCG reviewer will add that information to the consent form. The consent form doesn't need to be reviewed by HRPP prior to submitting it to the reviewing IRB. However, we're happy to take a look at it first and just make sure everything looks good and it's not something that's going to be kicked back to the reviewing IRB. You can do this by emailing it to the SIRB inbox. And then if the sponsor or lead site rejects any of our local context language, please contact UT Southwestern HRPP so we can review this and come to a resolution. The lead sites will often provide a local context form as well to collect site-specific information. We can fill this out on your behalf, and this also can be sent to the SIRB inbox. And then once the reliance agreement is completed, as I mentioned before, you'll work with the lead site or the sponsor to submit to the reviewing IRB for site approval. So once you obtain site approval and you have enough information, which can be to submit the Ethos application, you can go ahead and submit that to the UT Southwestern HRPP for the administrative review. We don't necessarily require that you have site approval in order to submit the application in Ethos. However, you should have enough information to where you can, for the most part, complete the entire form except for the site approval letter and the consent. And then what we can do is just review the application with what you have and then send it back to you with instructions to resubmit once you do get site approval and have that stamped consent form. And right here, I've just outlined some of the reliance specific items in the Ethos Smart Form. And so in section 1, it'll be important to indicate that you are going to use an external IRB. And then section 9 is where you'll add the site approval letters, the initial approval letter, approval letters for any items submitted or that were approved later and modifications. This section will include the signed reliance agreement, and then this is also where you can upload the HIPAA waiver that was issued by the reviewing IRB. And just some reminders when submitting the Ethos application. Any document that's submitted must have an approval letter from the reviewing IRB. And so anything that you're submitting in Ethos needs to be approved by the IRB of record. So this would include consent forms, protocols, any patient-facing materials, in most cases, IBs, recruitment materials, and then these items should have a corresponding approval letter. You'll need to provide the stamped informed consent document. In most cases, the external IRB will stamp the document as we do, and so we'll need the stamped document indicating that it's been approved by the external IRB. And then only documents which will be utilized at UT Southwestern or one of our affiliated sites need to be submitted, especially with a lot of these industry studies. There'll be dozens of websites and recruitment materials that aren't necessarily going to be used locally, but we only need those documents which will be used locally. All right, for HIPAA waivers, the terms of the reliance agreement will dictate whether the reviewing IRB or UT Southwestern serves as the privacy board for the study and is responsible for issuing HIPAA waivers. In most cases, when we're relying on a commercial IRB or an institutional IRB, that reviewing IRB will also be the privacy board, but there are some exceptions to this where we'll retain that responsibility and issue the HIPAA waivers. When an external IRB is serving as the privacy board, they must make all the HIPAA determinations and issue the waivers. So in this situation, it can't be requested from UT Southwestern through Ethos. It needs to be requested from the reviewing IRB. And that process will just depend on what it is for that particular institution. It's a little bit different for everybody. Sometimes they'll grant like a broad HIPAA waiver that'll apply to all sites. Sometimes they're issued on a site-by-site basis. So you would just need to get that information and be sure to communicate that to us in Ethos. So when UT Southwestern is the privacy board, all of the HIPAA waivers will need to be requested from the UT Southwestern IRB and Ethos. And in these cases, we'll use a separate HIPAA authorization. Instead of embedding the authorization language into the consent form, we'll use Form F. And so this will be the case for all NCIC IRB studies, and then any cases where the reviewing IRB is not also serving as a privacy board. So once the study is submitted in Ethos, should say Ethos, not EIRB, it will be administratively reviewed by the UT Southwestern IRB office. At this time, any performance site reviews will be performed. It's important to note that ancillary reviews still need to be conducted if they're required when you're using an external IRB. So, if it's a cancer study, if there's radiation involved, or if there's like a biologic product that requires IBC review, that ancillary committee review still needs to occur. And, relying on an external IRB doesn't mean you don't have to have that ancillary committee review. Once this is reviewed, the UT Southwestern IRB office will accept the review of the external IRB. This is after you get performance site approvals. And then once the study is green light, it can be activated and enrollment can begin. So for studies where we're using an external IRB, we set the expiration date to be 30 days following the expiration date set by the reviewing IRB. This is done to allow enough time for completing the continuing review and for it to be submitted in Ethos. All right, modifications. Any changes to the study which affect the local site must be submitted in Ethos as a modification. This would include any protocol amendments, changes to the consent form, any new or revised recruitment materials being used locally, revised IBs or device manuals, revised patient-facing materials. And these changes must be approved by the reviewing IRB prior to being submitted in Ethos. And then the approval letter for the modification from the reviewing IRB must be included as well. So for annual updates, when we're using an external IRB, we still require an annual update to be submitted in Ethos. As I mentioned before, the expiration date is set 30 days after the expiration date set by the reviewing IRB, so you should have plenty of time to submit the annual update. So in the annual update, you'll need to include the continuing review approval letter from the reviewing IRB, and don't submit the annual update until you receive this approval letter. If you submit it without the approval letter, it's just going to get kicked back to you with instructions to resubmit once you get the CR approval. And there are some situations where the external IRB won't set an expiration date. If that's the case, we still require the annual update, but you can just attach the approval letter stating that there's not an expiration date for the study. So when relying on an external IRB, the local PI is still responsible for submitting reportable events to the reviewing IRB and UT Southwestern HRPP. So it's important to be familiar with the reporting policies of the reviewing IRB and the reporting policies for UT Southwestern. So in addition reporting to the external IRB, any locally occurring events will need to be submitted in Ethos as a reportable event. So this would include emergency deviations, protocol violations, or serious or continuing noncompliance, UPERSOs, any research-related complaints. And these are locally occurring events that would need to be submitted. So if it happened at another institution, that doesn't need to be submitted as a reportable event. And so the time frame for these is 5 days, much like it is for reportable events, where UT Southwestern is the IRB of record. And then the external IRB's response or determination must be submitted to UT Southwestern HRPP within 10 working days of receipt. And here are some of our resources. If you have any questions or need any assistance, we offer office hours every Tuesday and Thursday from 10 to 11. Feel free to reach out to the SIRB inbox for any Reliance or SIRB related questions. And then we offer consultations where we can go over your particular scenario or study one-on-one. But that's all I have. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Brendan. Okay, it's my turn. Give me one moment and I will share my presentation with you all. Okay, all right. Regulatory fundamentals. What studies do not require IRB review? So I really wanted to do a presentation to just go back to basics, to go back to the very basics of human subjects research regulations, and try to maybe demystify a little bit some of the terms we use. Now, I understand that oftentimes certain submissions, it can be frustrating when you hear terms like, what does exempt mean? What is the difference between exempt, non-human subjects research? What is an exempt determination versus an IRB determination? What is the difference between those studies that do not actually undergo what is called the Institutional Review Board review and those that just get reviewed in the office? So I want to focus on that today, and hopefully you all will get some clarification and will enjoy this. I know many of us have been working with these things for years, but take it from me, it's very easy to go on autopilot and think through institutional policy and forget some of the regulatory distinctions that we have. Okay, so taking it all the way back to the very beginning here, what is the actual regulatory framework for conducting and reviewing human subjects research? Well, mostly we're talking about the Health and Human Services regulations and the Federal Drug Administration regulations. For HHS, that is 45 CFR 46, and that'll be subparts A, which we call the common rule, subparts B, C, and D. And B, C, and D deal with specific vulnerable populations, which I could mention here later on in the presentation. And then there's the Federal Drug Administration, Food and Drug Administration regulations, which are in 21 CFR parts 50 and 56. Those two parts deal with what exactly is human subjects research, and the IRB reviews. IRB review rules from the FDA. Parts 312 and 812 deal specifically with investigational drugs and investigational devices. Now, today we're going to ignore the FDA a little bit. If your research is FDA regulated, meaning that you are conducting an experiment on a human being, where you are testing the safety and or efficacy of a drug or device, then you are already well within the realm of human subjects research requiring institutional review board review. So we're going to talk about those things that under the HHS regulations, where the common rule would be considered, exempt or not human subjects research, and so on. Okay, so the common rule, again, that is 45 CFR 46 subpart A. This applies to all non-FDA regulated human subjects research conducted at UT Southwestern or within the UT Southwestern orbit here. And I bring that up. We apply this to all human subjects research. If you decide, if you want to go and read the common rule regulations yourselves, I don't want you to get confused when you see it talking specifically about federally funded research. That is the way the regulations are written, but we still apply this as per institutional policy to all human subjects research. Now, subparts B, C, and D contain additional requirements for research. Subpart B deals with pregnant women, fetuses, neonates. Subpart C is about research involving prisoners, and subpart D is research involving children. And where that stuff is relevant to our presentation today, particularly in exempt research, I will bring that up as we move along. Okay, so the Institutional Review Board, what exactly is the IRB? What is it for? I think that we all sort of get into a habit of maybe using the term or the acronym IRB very loosely. You know, I'm submitting my IRB, or I'm going to go talk to the IRB. But really what the IRB is it's a regulatory body. There's parameters around who can serve on an IRB, how many people have to be on an IRB, what it is that the IRB is supposed to do, but that is still distinct from, say, a human research protection program like our office. Okay, so what the Institutional Review Board does is it is required to review non-exempt, with some exceptions, which I can talk about later, so non-exempt human subjects research. Now, IRB review can be either full board review or expedited review. It's important for you all to remember that whether it's expedited or full board, it's still IRB review. Okay, expedited review is a mode for conducting IRB review, but still a study that undergoes expedited review, just like a full board review, is required to adhere to the policy of 45 CFR, to all of the regulations. Okay, so maybe it's maybe a better distinction is to think of it more like you have exempt human subjects research and non-exempt human subjects research. But anyway, we don't care about IRB review today. We're more concerned about those things that do not actually undergo IRB review. So let's take that what we said earlier, the IRB review is required for non-exempt human subjects research, and let's flip it around so we can start introducing the types of projects or studies that would not undergo an actual IRB review. So first would be those activities that do not meet the regulatory definition of research. Here at our institution, we call those non-regulated research, or NRR studies if you're submitting an ethos. Now I have to be careful. Back when I used to do these reviews years ago, and I would be talking to investigators and study teams, and I would say your study is not research. It didn't make some people very happy with me. What we really mean when we say that is it doesn't meet the regulatory definition of research. So if you ever hear somebody say, "Oh, this isn't research," don't be offended by that. That's all that somebody in the IRB world means when they say that. Okay, so that's NRR. I'm going to go into detail about each of these as we go along. Next is research that does not involve human subjects. And there's a definition for human subjects, which we'll discuss. We call that non-human research, or NHR. Okay. And then there is human subjects research that meets one or more of the exemption criterion. Okay. And we call that exempt research. Now, all of these, and again, there's some exceptions, would require some sort of administrative review if they're coming to us. But what does exempt actually mean? It's exempt from something. So if you read the common law regulations, it will tell you that it is exempt from this policy, meaning the regulations. So it's exempt from things like having to have an IRB review it, having an IRB say if it meets the criteria for approval. All of the very particular informed consent rules and so on. Okay, now that doesn't mean that institutionally, some institutions will require additional things similar to an expedited study for exempt, but just per the raw regulations, that's what it means. It's exempt from the rest of the regulations. Okay, now a quick disclaimer, because I do not want to get any of you in trouble, nor do I want to get myself in trouble with my colleagues in the HRPP, especially before our holiday party. Just because, and I'm telling you again, we're talking about the regulatory distinctions. Because I say that something doesn't require IRB review, it does not mean that you should not submit it. There are still administrative reviews that may be required, and certainly some that are encouraged. So, for instance, for exempt, if you want to get a determination that your research is exempt, you do need to submit that to our office to get that administrative determination. It's an exemption determination. It's not an IRB determination, but it is still administratively reviewed and it is required. Administrative review of non-regulated research and non-human research is recommended. I would say highly recommended and encouraged. And it may even be required, in fact, it is required, when there is some sort of data or material transfer, because they need to be able to link those activities with the agreement for that data or material transfer. Administrative review is conducted by the Human Research Protection Program Office, not the Institutional Review Board. Remember, the HRPP manages the IRB. The IRB is within the HRPP, but they do more and they do these administrative reviews. For instance, Brendan was talking earlier about when we're relying on another institution, we're not the IRB of record. Therefore, any determinations we give for those are administrative determinations. They're not IRB determinations. Similar thing going on here. We're still giving you some sort of determination, but it's not coming from the IRB. All right, these are submitted and reviewed in Ethos. So all three of those things I've mentioned, non-regulated, non-human, and exempt, there is a way to submit those in Ethos. You just go in and start a new study like you would any study, and you can select there on probably the first page, I believe, which route you think it should be. And if you are going to submit, and especially for exempt research, activities should not begin, research activities, prior to the receipt of a determination, an exempt determination, an NRR determination, or an NHR determination. Just like an IRB reviewed study, don't begin until you have the determination from our office. All right, so let's start with non-regulated research. What are those definitions that I alluded to earlier? So the Common Rule lays out a definition for research, and that is, this is just verbatim from the regulations here, a systematic investigation including research development and testing and evaluation designed to develop and contribute to generalizable knowledge. Now, I want you to just keep designed in your head. We'll go into more detail about that, but that's a very important word here in that definition. Systematic, that would mean like a use of a clear plan, system, or method to conduct a detailed examination or inquiry of facts. And then generalizable, this is something that is universally or widely applicable. So some examples of this, and when you submit this, if you submit this in Ethos, you'll see it categorized into things like quality improvement, program evaluation, case reports, and a few other things. Those are important categories. They can help you see if your activities meet the definition of research, but really the important thing is that definition itself, a systematic investigation designed to contribute to generalizable knowledge. So going back to that word, designed to contribute to generalizable knowledge. So the primary intent of the project can determine if it is regulated research. So was the project implemented primarily with the intent to contribute to generalizable knowledge? Okay, was it designed to do that? Lots of things can be generalizable. In fact, when I train IRB analysts, and the first thing a new IRB analyst does is learn how to review these NRR and NHR submissions. And this is actually very difficult. I can assure you there's a lot of gray area here, especially when we're talking about intent and when we're trying to interpret what is being submitted to us. And so oftentimes, I say, okay, we need to find out if this is actually being designed to contribute to generalizable knowledge, or if the project is being implemented to address or evaluate something particular. It may be something in a clinic. They want to look at their practices. They want to improve their practices, whatever it may be. But the one thing I tell them is like, never ask the question when you go to the research team, never go back and ask, is your study generalizable? because they almost always say yes, because they think of conference posters and things like that in the future that, yeah, we're doing this, but of course this could be useful to others in the field. That's not, so we had to be careful. Are you initiating the project specifically to contribute to science? Or are you doing it for a particular reason locally or in your clinic or whatever it may be? For instance, the training program I do for IRB analysts, we've been doing over the last year. I could systematically go back. I could do surveys and interviews, and can go look back and look at improvement over time, and analyze that and see if the program is working, and use that as a strategy to help improve the program. And then I could take that to a conference as a poster or as an abstract or whatever it may be. But that doesn't make it all of a sudden human subjects research per the definition, okay? And it wouldn't make any sense either, because new IRB analysts are required to go through the program. There's no informed consent for something like that. So anyway, intent is very important here, and it's very important for you all when you are submitting these. It'll really help the IRB analyst if you think about that and sort of lay that out, write that out with that in mind, because these can get very, very confusing. And that is to say, also, non-regulated research can be published. There are publications that will accept it. It just can't be published as human subjects research. You can't say that it's quality improvement and then all of a sudden go publish it as research. You have to publish it as quality improvement. Be presented at conferences, whatever. Okay. So that doesn't make it or break it. Now I understand that there may be some good reasons to take something that's quality improvement and instead make it research. That's fine too, but just understand that these things are still possible. Okay, moving on. So first we ask the question, is the project that we're reviewing research? Okay, if it is research, it's a systematic investigation designed primarily with the intent to contribute to generalizable knowledge. The next thing we have to find out is, okay, well, is it research involving human subjects? So the common rule also has a definition for a human subject, which I will read here. That is a living individual. I think that's the first thing. If you're doing research involving records from deceased individuals, that does not meet the definition of human subjects, and therefore the common rule does not apply. So a living individual about whom is also very important, but I'll come back to that in a minute. So about whom an investigator, whether professional or student conducting research, obtains information or biospecimens through intervention or interaction with the individual, and uses, studies, or analyzes the information or biospecimens. So this is kind of your classic study. You're going to interact with people. Maybe they'll do a survey, or even in a clinical trial, whatever. If you're interacting with them, there's probably going to be some consent required as well. Okay, so or a living individual about whom an investigator obtains, uses, studies, analyzes, or generates identifiable private information or identifiable biospecimens. So this is the big one. For something that doesn't meet the definition of human research, it's almost always a study where there is data, but the data is anonymous. And it is anonymous, or it is anonymous to the investigators. So those who are conducting the study will never have any way, at any point in the life of the study, they would never have any way to identify these individuals. From their perspective, that data is anonymous, and it's always been anonymous to them. Okay? Now let's go back to that about whom thing, because there are some scenarios where you're interacting with a human subject, like a survey study, where it may not meet the definition because the information you're collecting is not about a particular individual. Say I want to look at training programs and study training programs at other human research protection program offices. I could reach out to various institutions, and if I were just asking questions like, how many IRB professionals do you have on staff? How long does it take? What's your training program? How long does the training program take? Those types of questions, those are not about anybody in particular. But the moment you start asking somebody's opinion, that is about somebody. So I think some people get confused about that, where they think that they're not asking anything about an individual. But if you ask an opinion, that becomes information about a particular human subject. So that's an important distinction there. Okay, so we have non-regulated and non-human subjects research. And if you look in the regulations, and if a study does not meet these definitions, doesn't meet one of these definitions, if it doesn't meet the research definition, you can just stop there. Don't even worry about human subjects. But if it doesn't meet either of those definitions, then the common rule just does not apply. It does not apply to that type of work or those types of projects. Okay. All right. Now moving on, exempt. Now, exempt just means it's exempt from the rule. You could say technically that non-regulated and non-human are also exempt. They don't have to adhere to the policy because the policy doesn't apply. But when we say exempt in the IRB world, we are speaking specifically about a particular categories of research. And these are things that do meet the definition of research and things that are research involving human subjects. Okay, so they meet all the definitions. So otherwise, in any other case, you would assume that the common rule applies to them. But because they fall into certain categories, that we don't need to apply the regulations to those. Okay, and that's why they don't undergo IRB review, because IRB review is part of the common rule policy. Okay, so there are 8 exemption categories, and I would say that at UT Southwestern, we're really only going to use 4. Categories 7 and 8 are just not. We will not use those at all, because those have something called broad consent that an institution needs to implement, and we have not implemented that. Therefore, those categories are not available to us. Categories 5 and 6, I suppose in theory, there could be a study that meets those categories, but having talked to my colleagues in the HRPP and in my own experience, I have never in my 23 years exempted a study in categories 5 or category 6. Not to say it can't happen, but probably won't. So what we care about are the exempt categories 1 through 4, which we'll go into in a moment. Okay. Importantly, I think I've said this over and over again, but just one more time, exempt research does not undergo IRB review and is not subject to the regulatory informed consent requirements, because it's not non-exempt human subjects research. There are some exceptions, and I will bring that up as we move through the 4 categories that we care about. All right, so exempt category 1. Now, this is research conducted in established or commonly accepted educational settings that specifically involves normal educational practices that are not likely to adversely impact students' opportunity to learn, required educational content, or the assessment of educators who provide instructions. This includes most research on regular and special education instructional strategies, and research on the effectiveness of or the comparison among instructional techniques, curricula, or classroom management methods. Okay, typically things that are done in educational setting, looking at curricula, doing some tests around that. A lot of those sorts of things would fall into category 1. I don't think we have as much of that here, but we do get exempt category 1 occasionally. So let's move on to exempt category 2, which is one that we do use rather frequently. So this is research that includes interactions involving educational tests. That could be cognitive, diagnostic, aptitude, achievement, survey procedures, interview procedures, or observation of public behavior, including visual or auditory recording. I think most of the time, when we use exempt category 2, that's going to be for survey research or interview research. One important thing, and something you may have heard before, is that we do not allow exempt category 2 to be used for research involving children. And I think it's a general rule. That's a good that is a rule. There's exceptions to this. If you look in the regulations, it says the category cannot apply to children unless the study itself is limited to educational tests or the observation of public behavior. If that data is recorded anonymously, like you're never gonna, once you do the educational test, or if you're observing public behavior, you're never going to know after who those people were. That is acceptable. We just don't really see that very often. So I think just generally we say that exempt category 2 is not going to apply to children. All right. Oh, by the way, and prisoners. So you cannot use exempt categories for research involving prisoners, any of them. I should have said that before, but just again, it doesn't happen very frequently here, but that's just another important thing to remember. Exempt category 3. Now, this is research involving benign behavioral interventions in conjunction with the collection of information from an adult subject through verbal or written responses, including data entry, or audio-visual recording if the subject prospectively agrees to the intervention and information collection. I think some studies I've seen recently are where they're using maybe virtual reality to deal with something, or playing games. You know, how do the games affect the cognitive function or recovery or whatever it may be? These sorts of things can be considered benign behavioral interventions. It's the intervention itself that has to be behavioral. Okay, it could be addressing things like nausea, whatever. It's like a physical condition, but it's the intervention itself that needs to be behavioral. Now, this one also will not apply to children at all. So similarly to category 2, we're not going to apply exempt category 2 to research involving children. Now, those pediatric research that falls into these categories would usually just as easily fall into an expedited category. So yeah, there's a little bit more that you'll need to do, but the regulations do not allow those to be used for children in most cases. All right. So this is just a continuation from exempts category 2 and 3. They have some specific rules in order to use both of them, in order to use either of them, that the following criteria must be met. First, the information obtained is recorded by the investigator in such a manner that the identity of the human subjects cannot readily be ascertained directly or through identifiers linked to the subjects. So doing an anonymous survey is a great example of this. Like, you may be doing interviews or focus groups, but you're not going to collect any identifiers about that. So when you go back and look, you're not going to know who the people were who were on the research, or at least you're not going to know which data points connect to which individual that subject. Okay. Next, any disclosure of the human subject's responses outside the research would not reasonably place the subjects at risk of criminal or civil liability, or be damaging to the subject's financial standing, employability, educational advancement, or reputation. By the way, all 3 of these are ORs. It doesn't have to meet all of these. It has to meet one of these to be exempt under category 2 or 3. So in this case, maybe you have identifiers, but the questions you're asking are benign, and they wouldn't put anybody at risk. And you can keep a low bar here. Could this be embarrassing to somebody? Would be a reason why we may not want to use this. But generally, for benign types of questions, research activities, you may be able to use identifiers if it meets this criterion. Okay, and then next, or the information obtained is recorded by the investigator in such a manner that the identity of the human subjects can be ascertained directly through identifiers linked to the subject. So you are going to maintain identifiers. And an IRB conducts a limited IRB review to make the determination required by criteria for approval. I'll talk about in a second. This is the exception. This is the exception I talked about earlier, where exempt research does have some sort of IRB oversight. So if you see here at the bottom, I talked about the criteria for approval. Those studies that require IRB approval, the IRB is required. When an IRB approves something, what the IRB is saying is that the study meets the criteria for approval. And there's a whole list of criteria that the study have to meet, like risk to subjects are minimized, risk and benefit ratio is reasonable, you're getting informed consent, so on and so on. Well, for categories 2 and 3, if they are going to maintain identifiers, then an IRB or an IRB member, this would really be treated more like an expedited review, an IRB member will conduct a limited review and only apply the 7th criterion for approval. So all the IRB reviewer needs to say is that, yes, this study can be exempt and it does meet the 7th criterion for approval, which is that there are protections in place for confidentiality and those sorts of things, like maintaining data and so on. They're going to make that they have a good plan in place to ensure there are protections. Okay, the study is still exempt. It just has a little bit more of a robust review, and that is the exception where exempt research does have some sort of IRB oversight. Okay. And the final one that we use, and probably the one that we use the most, is going to be exempt category 4. This is secondary research being research that already exists or will exist for purposes other than the research project. Like the data or biospecimens in some cases, will have been collected for other purposes, not directly related to the research that's currently being reviewed. Okay, so that's what secondary means. So secondary research for which consent is not required. Secondary research uses of identifiable private information or identifiable biospecimens. So this is what distinguishes this from non-human research. At some point in the game, the investigators would have access to identifiers. Okay, that is the big distinction. Non-human subjects research, it's anonymous from start to finish from the perspective of those conducting the research study. Not necessarily the case here. So to go into more detail about that, exempt category 4 can only be used if at least one of the following criteria is met. Again, it has to be one of these. First, the identifiable private information or identifiable biospecimens are publicly available. Okay, still identifiable, but publicly available. Information, which may include information about biospecimens, is recorded by the investigator in such a manner that the identity of the human subjects cannot readily be ascertained directly or through identifiers, coded data here, linked to the subjects. The investigator does not contact the subjects and the investigator will not re-identify subjects. So what would happen here? So you're doing a medical record review and you go through and you only extract data that once you've extracted it, now that you have it separate from the medical records, you have no way of knowing who that person is. So the investigators or the study team actively take steps to anonymize the data before analysis. Okay, and this used to be the rule for exempt category 4. In 2020, the new common rule came into effect, and now we see more things under exempt category 4. But previously, it was very strict. The data had to be existing in the past, and researchers had to actually anonymize them in order to be exempt, as opposed to expedited. But now, thanks to the new common rule, we have this third option here. The research involves only information collection and analysis involving the investigator's use of identifiable health information when that use is regulated under HIPAA. Okay, so we're lucky. We're a HIPAA covered entity. And because that data is HIPAA covered and HIPAA protected, then you can still exempt that study and do analysis of identifiable information. Now, an important thing to know about this is this third option here, when you're using HIPAA as a way to have an exemption, is that you cannot use that for biospecimens. We're talking about data only, but you cannot be using identifiable biospecimens in an exempt way. Now, you could anonymize the biospecimens, and it could be exempt under Category 4, just like it was in the old common rule. You just can't use this one like HIPAA criterion here. And by the way, before I end here, HIPAA, I want you to understand that we are a HIPAA covered entity. NRR, non-human research, exempt research. We still have to consider HIPAA. Now, the HIPAA regulations and the human subjects research regulations are distinct and separate regulations. Of course, in our day-to-day, we kind of treat them as one-to-one. We have HIPAA authorization and consent at the same time. But just because something is non-human research, meaning that it's anonymous, it may still be covered by HIPAA, or HIPAA still covers information about deceased individuals for a certain period of time. But HIPAA has, PHI is much more specific, like these sorts of things, like zip codes. Zip code is considered PHI. So if you're receiving zip codes from another institution, you may have to have a DUA just per the HIPAA regulations. HIPAA still applies. But just because there's PHI, when you look at the common rule regulations, the common rule is more context-based. Could you, as the investigator, take this information, like a zip code, and be able to identify who that person is reasonably? Oftentimes the answer is no. So that's why you can have something be not human subjects research, but still have some HIPAA regulations that apply. All right, and just in time here, that concludes my presentation. We have about 2 minutes here. I think I saw something about a question. Let me try to answer that real fast before I let you go, although I think maybe it's...
I'm trying to respond to it now, Scott.
Okay. All right. Well, we have some questions that have been typed up. We'll respond to those in writing and get those to you shortly. Sorry we didn't have time for sorry to be so long-winded here. We missed out on the Q&A session. But feel free to reach out to us. You can reach out to the HRPP via email at hrpp@utsouthwestern.edu. We also have our office hours on Tuesdays and Thursdays if you have any questions about these topics. I want to thank Brendan also for presenting today, and thank you all for attending today's session. The next Research Matters session is scheduled for January 20th. So have a happy new year, and we will see you all again in 2026. Thank you.